So I wonder if you had a time machine and you could go back and tell your younger self what you would say to your younger self at moments when you think back. For me, it's when I'm road tripping. Maybe for you, it's on a mission trip or meditation, or a place you run into somebody you haven't seen for a while, and it brings back a memory of some other chapter of life, something you did, something you failed to do, something you said that you wish to God you hadn't said, a decision you made that 100 times over, if you had to do it again, you would make it 100 times differently than you did before. What would you say to yourself in those places when you think back, you think, I wish that wasn't me, but it was me. You see, in the Bible, we have two really different sides of the coin of King David. We have the Chronicles of Kings. It's light reading for bedtime, but it is also the royal archives of the kings. It's, in short, the public facade of King David. It's the charismatic leader, all of the good things he does, giant killer, leader of tens of thousands, generous. Is there anybody from the house of Saul that I can have yet at my table? Mephibosheth, say that 10 times fast. And a guy who has a heart after God's own heart. Somebody everybody wants to be like. He's popular, he's good enough, he's smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like him. But then we have 1st and 2nd Samuel. And it's almost like it pulls the curtain away and gives you a backstage pass, not just into the life of the king, but into the life of the man, David. The good things, yes, but we find things that aren't in the Chronicles. This affair with Bathsheba, the estrangement with his son Absalom, and the way he dies. The plot with Uriah and the execution order. All these things that make David very human. But I think also each of us, when we look at this text, and we'll get into it in depth in a moment, it's hard not to see our strengths and our failures in the mix. After all, if a man after God's own heart, somebody that everybody's excited to be king, this guy with all his power, with just a little bit of temptation, has this mighty giant slayer, has a mighty fall. And so, as we look at this text, it's got some heavy foreshadowing. But before we get into it, it's kind of like another one of those things where we're in the life of David, and if you haven't been reading along at home, it's midstream. Just before this text, the prince of Ammon, a nation to the east of Israel, where modern-day Jordan is, his father has died, the king. So David sends some emissaries to mourn and send his condolences. But the emissaries to the young prince say, David doesn't care. He's not really here to send his condolences. He's here to spy. So in the text I call beards and buttocks, these guys shave David's emissaries' beards and cut off their cloaks at midsection. You can read into that as much as you want. Talk about insult. So they send him home, tails between their legs, and they tell David, and it starts a war with Ammon. So David and his men go and they fight this nation. They have him right up to the walls of the city gates of what is modern-day Amman, the capital of Jordan. It's called Rabbah in the Bible. And winter hits. So they pull up the campaign, they go home. The calendar months page ahead, and it's time for spring, time for David to go finish what he started in this war. But we have this heavy foreshadowing. In the time of spring, when kings, David, that's you, go off to war, David sent Joab, his general, and all the fighting men of Israel, lest we forget anybody except for David. But David remained in Jerusalem. And then we have this, it happened. Uh-oh. What do you mean it happened? Something dark. David is getting up from bed. He's walking around the rooftops. You've heard this story before, I'm sure. If not, you've seen TV shows about it. David's at the palace. He's also the king. Bathsheba is taking a bath on the top of her rooftop. Now, I want to dispel a couple rumors, a couple myths, and some bad preaching. Bathsheba did not seduce David. She's not up to her feminine wiles. No, she is a poor wife of a foreign man, simply cleansing herself. The king, doing a little peeping Tom, spots her, asks his men, go find out who that is. And verse 3 should be the showstopper. That's the wife of Uriah, the daughter of Eliam. She's spoken for. She's a married woman. And just so we don't miss it, Uriah and Eliam are not inconsequential people. These two guys are two of 30 men who have stuck with David since long before he was king. When King Saul was jealous of him and he had David on the run as a fugitive. You remember he's living cave to cave. He's going from mountainside to mountainside. He's living with the Philistines, their enemies, pretending to be a madman because Saul is hell-bent on having him killed. And these guys stand by him through thick and thin, no matter what he's facing. They save his life countless times. These guys are loyal to him. They are friends. They are willing to give their lives for David. He is king because of them. Yes, that Uriah, David, that man who's had your back all this time, that's a turning point, right? The chips are down, David. This is the situation. But he blows through the stop sign. Bring her here. David sees. David asks. David takes. It's impossible, I think, to miss the warnings of the prophet Samuel that we started off with this summer, and later in Deuteronomy, where it says, be careful, Israel, because if you choose to have a king who leads over you, a human leader instead of God, that king will take horses for their army. That king will take your sons for their wars. That king will take your money for all their building projects and palaces and grandiose plans. And they will take your daughters for their harems. And that verb, shakav, is all through this narrative. Back to Bathsheba. I've heard commentators say, well, the king sent for her. She went consensually. This is consensual. Give me a break. He's the king. If the king summons you, you're going. She doesn't say anything. David sends her home. One wonders if David would have thought about her ever again if those two words back to him, who knows how long later, I'm pregnant. And by the by, when David is called to the carpet for his actions, it's David, not David and Bathsheba, that are accused of wrongdoing. And it says, and what David did was evil in the eyes of the Lord. I think about Robert Louis Stevenson's book, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Dr. Jekyll is this upstanding man, a doctor, well-respected, a health professional working in the field of healing others. But he's, like all of us, has a little bit of a shadow self. And so he concocts this formula to give him permission to do some of the baser things he's fantasized about or wants. And so he begins taking this formula and momentarily turns into this unrecognizable, kind of sinister Mr. Hyde, this grotesque figure. But if you read the book, spoiler alert if you haven't, Jekyll begins to take so much of the formula that eventually he takes so much of it that he can't stop the transformation anymore. He only is Hyde. And the good man that was once Dr. Jekyll is gone. David's tempted, David acts on the temptation, and then David thinks. I can almost see the smoke and the wheels turning in his mind when he gets the news that she's pregnant, and he thinks, uh-oh, what I had done in the dark, what I had said, this is just one time, And one wonders, by the way, if Bathsheba was the only one David saw and sent for. But here's the one that's found out. The time of Michigan State doctors and gymnasts and all kinds of actresses and other people who have been subjugated to people in power. But David's found out. So you see the wheels turning. How can I get out of this? Now, thankfully, this is David and not you and I, right? We never play these games. You never were a kid in school and the principal calls you down the office and you think, okay, how can I spin this so that I don't get in trouble? It's a very human thing to do. But maybe the text is a warning to us of the power of taking one turn, one decision, and then maybe you've experienced this, maybe you haven't. Maybe you are more angelic than I. But where one misdeed turns into a lie, a cover-up, and then a more complicated lie, and pretty soon it's a web of fabrications that you are so far down the road of who you want to be, who you've been before God, that you don't recognize yourself anymore. Send for Uriah, bring him home. I will have him go home. It says, go home and wash your feet, Uriah. It's a euphemism for go home, have sex with your wife. Because then it could be Uriah's kid, right? Not mine. Do the math. I mean, it'd be close enough. He won't suspect a thing. Doesn't that kid look like David? But Uriah, and here's the really haunting part of the text. Uriah echoes David at a younger age. He said, far be it from me. The same words David says when his mighty men, Uriah and Eliam, go out to get water from the well of their enemies. They sneak into the enemy camp because David says he's thirsty. So they go out, they risk their lives, they bring him back water from an enemy camp well. And David pours it out and says, your lives are worth more than my desire to have a drink. Far be it from me before God to devalue you so much that I would send you on some flippant mission to satisfy a flippant desire of mine. You guys are not down here and I'm up here. We're on equal playing field. You are my peers. You are my friends. How ironic that he sends the very man who did such things to his death later. But David's plan is, yeah, you can go home, go sleep with your wife. This will all be over and I'll be in the clear. But again, Uriah mirrors the man David has been, the man after God. So, Lord, far be it from me, the ark of the covenant, your men, your commander, everybody. And I wonder if there's like a little bit of a barb to Uriah's voice. I would love to hear this conversation. Everybody but you, David, are out there fighting. My brothers in arms are dying out there. How can I go home and eat and drink and be with my wife? By the way, David's rules for his armies, there's so many ironies laced in this. David's rule for his armies were no sex with women, no sex with your wives while we're on campaign fighting wars. One wonders what David was thinking when he said, you guys go on ahead. I'm going to stay back. Uriah doesn't go for it. He sleeps at the doorway of the king's palace like a loyal soldier, like a dog. I'm not going to leave my king's side. My duty is to the crown, to your orders. And when David realized plan A and plan B won't work, he sends and signs the execution orders for his friend to be sent on a suicide mission to be killed. Does it get any darker than this? One infidelity turns into a series of manipulations, deceptions, and lies, and murder. And that's where today's text ends. Happy good news. A few words about the text. Going back to Bathsheba. We're talking about a situation where somebody has great power. You've heard the golden rule? Not the one from Jesus. Those who have the gold make the rules. David has all the power in this situation. He sends for Bathsheba. She has no voice. The first thing I want to say about this text is, while biblical scholars debate, was this consensual? Did David rape her? Here's what I can tell you about the text. It says that David lay with Bathsheba, not that they lay together, which is unique. Seems to go against a mutuality. And it says shakav, to take, which could mean sexual intercourse. It does in many places in the Bible, like a normal sexual intercourse that's consensual. But it also appears in nearly every account where rape happens in the Hebrew Bible. It is true, it is not like 2 chapters later, but how ironic is it that just next to this text in Scripture, the writer of 1 Samuel talks about the crown prince, David's firstborn, Amnon, and his brutal rape of his sister, half-sister, Tamar. The apple apparently doesn't fall far from the tree. If Dad can do it, and when I read from the Bureau of Justice, just 2019, 1 every 6 women has either survived or been the victim of sexual assault in our country. That's before COVID. 5-year rolling average. So the first thing I want to say is, this isn't some ancient text where the powerful take advantage of the powerless. And I apologize because I know this is close to home for some of you. The fact that somebody powerful has done something that somebody who has no voice or power in the situation, I want to say to any Bathsheba or victim, because somebody has done something egregious or terrible to you, does not make it okay, never makes it okay in God's eyes or anyone else's, nor is it something that should define you. Just because somebody has done something to you does not make that who you are. You are a beautiful child in the image of God, and a God who loves you deeply. Human choices, human evil and dark choices, do not define who we are. First point. The second is that no matter who we are, we might not have ever contemplated some of the things David has done. But all of us, as I started this sermon, have those moments of regret, of shame, those things that, gosh, if we had that redo button, we would, when you're kids and you're playing and you play tag and somebody says shield or no takebacks, well, how many of us would like a takeback, or in golfing terms, like a mulligan on life, on something we've done wrong that has a shadow of regret? I'm sure finally, when David is called at a carpet by the prophet Nathan for what he has done, he does confess. He repents. He said, my God, I don't like the person I become. There is still room for God to use David and grace despite some of the ugly things he's done. You're never so far gone that God can't continue to use you. There's an old Native American proverb that says, a medicine man was talking to his son, and he said, there are 2 wolves that live within the spirit of each of us. One that is altruistic and good by nature, brave and courageous, seeks to do what is right, what is light. And then there is another that is more predatory, that is darker, shadow, is selfish and greedy, and will do whatever it takes to get what it wants. And the young boy, wide-eyed, says, Papa, which one wins when they fight? Whichever one I feed. Whichever one I feed. Each of us has the potential for great good, great kindness, generosity, as we've seen David have. A man after God's own heart. that doesn't mean that he and us don't have our Achilles heel of spirituality, the places where we fall and blow it royally, pun intended. I have to throw out there that there's a couple of questions that linger in my mind's eye. As David is confronted by Nathan, we'll get to that next week, and some truth-telling. I wonder, David confesses to God, David comes clean with himself, but I can't help but wonder, does he ever tell Bathsheba what he's done? You know, after she marries him? Does he ever say, you know that report, that letter you got in the mail from the courier to tell you your husband was killed in battle? Yeah, that wasn't an accident. I'm Hyde. I'm the monster who took that from you. That would be a hard thing to do. I wonder if David's courage went that far. The secrets sometimes that are too heavy to name. Sometimes we carry them to the grave. This text is messy. It might be infamous. We all might know it. But when it comes down to it, it has a kind of honesty and vulnerability when it pulls back the curtain of life and says, this is everything. This is the good king. This is the bad king. This is the ugly. And you know what? God sees it all. And God says, David is still my child. Uriah is still my child. Bathsheba is still my daughter. And I've made them beautifully and wonderfully. And I haven't given up on any of them. So David, don't give up on yourself. Bathsheba, don't give up on yourself. And you got to feel for poor Uriah, the man who has incredible integrity and is the first mirror up to David's face that he just refuses to see. So I'll ask you one more time, are there any places on those road trips or when you're by yourself and memories come flooding back from a song or from a place and you say, I can't believe that was me. Well, I'd say to you one last thing, one last piece of good news in a awful, tough, horrible story. Don't let it define you. The worst things we ever do don't have to be who we are. You can either be paralyzed by them, stuck. You can feed that wolf and let it be who you are, or you can learn from it and step into the promise of a God whose forgiveness is deeper than you could possibly know, whose grace seems undeserved, irrational, and sometimes unfair. How can you forgive that? And an invitation into being something better before a God who calls you by name and says, who I see you to be is certainly not that. Come, find some healing. Name where you've been and leave it in the rearview mirror. Because I think you're worth it, even when you don't.